The Arizona Territory was a land of dust where stories lay buried beneath the earth, forgotten like the bones of those who once lived them. Yet some tales refused to fade away. This is the story of a solitary woman, a town gripped by fear, and a choice that would echo through history's canyons. It's a tale of a doctor from the East carrying nothing but her conviction, and a wounded Apache warrior already condemned by the color of his skin. She stood between a man's life and a firing squad's rifles, and what unfolded in those desperate hours became a frontier legend. The heat of Redemption Gulch was a tangible force. It shimmered off the cracked street, clung to the rough timber of the storefronts, and baked into the earth beneath their feet. The silence of the afternoon hung heavy, brittle, as if waiting to shatter. It was a silence, Doctor. Clara Hayes knew all too well in the 2 years since she'd left the bustling streets of Philadelphia for the ragged edge of the world. Here silence wasn't peace. It was a held breath, waiting for the next eruption of violence, as inevitable as the sunrise. On that scorching Tuesday in August of 1883, the eruption came not with the sound of gunfire, but with the frantic pounding of a child's fist against her infirmary door. Dr. Hayes. Dr. Hayes, come quick. Clara, her hands still smelling of carbolic soap as she cleaned her instruments, swung the door open. Young Jesse O'Connor, the blacksmith's son, stood there, pale, under a spray of freckles, gasping for air. It's Pa. A horse ran through him. His leg. It ain't right, ma'am. It ain't right at all. Without a word, Clara grabbed her worn leather medical bag. Show me Jesse. The scene at the blacksmith shop was a familiar one, a tableau of frontier calamity. Buck O'Connor, a man whose strength could shoe a draft horse with one hand, lay on a bed of straw, sweating through his clothes, his face twisted in pain. His left leg, below the knee, was bent at an unnatural angle. Clara knelt, her movements calm and practiced in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the onlookers. Someone fetch me a bucket of the cleanest water you've got, and whiskey, a lot of it. She worked with a focused intensity that set her apart from the rough folk of this land. She was an anomaly here, an educated physician who spoke of germs and sanitation, who had chosen to practice in this dusty outpost after a personal tragedy in the East had made the anonymity of the frontier seem like a balm. The townsfolk respected her skill, but they watched her from a distance as if she were a rare bird that had accidentally landed in their humble chicken coop. As she set Buck's compound fracture, a task that required all her strength and his whiskey-fueled stoicism, a new sound pierced through the murmurs of the crowd, the rhythmic, disciplined beat of approaching horses. This wasn't the lazy gait of cowboys or prospectors. No, this was the determined march of cavalry or something like it. Into the harsh sunlight rode a column of 6 men. They weren't regular soldiers. Their attire was a mix of civilian clothes and government-issued gear, but they rode with a chilling uniformity. At their head was a man who seemed chiseled from the very landscape itself. He was tall and straight-backed in the saddle with a sharp, clean-shaven face and eyes the color of a winter sky. A silver star gleamed on his vest, an emblem of authority that felt colder than any sheriff's badge. This was U.S. Marshal Jasper Cole, a name spoken in hushed tones from the saloons of Prescott to the lonely ranches of the Tonto Basin. He was known as a finisher. When the army couldn't pacify a region, when outlaws grew too bold, they sent for Cole. He didn't bend the law. He was the law, sharp and unyielding. Cole reined in his horse, scanning the small town with the eye of a strategist as though it were a map full of tactical weaknesses. His men fanned out, hands resting near their holsters, expressions grim. One of his deputies, a Weasley man named Zeke Taylor, dismounted and strode toward the blacksmith shop. Sheriff Wade Carter, a man whose belly hung over his belt and whose approach to law enforcement favored talk over violence, met him halfway. Marshal, Cole, he said, his voice laced with caution. Didn't expect you in Redemption Gulch. We're not here for a social call, Sheriff. Zeke's sneer was almost as cold as Cole's gaze. We're tracking a murderer, an Apache buck named of Tate Blackwolf. Him and his band jumped a supply wagon bound for Fort McDowell 2 days ago, killed 3 men. We trailed him this far, he added, his voice carrying through the crowd. Fear rippled through the onlookers, quick and sharp. The Apache wars had left deep scars across the territory. To the settlers of Redemption Gulch, the word Apache was synonymous with terror, midnight raids, brutal ambushes, and unseen death. Clara, her work on Buck O'Connor's leg now finished, was wrapping it in clean linen. She heard the words, and a familiar knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She had seen the aftermath of raids, but she had also treated the victims of unprovoked attacks on peaceful native camps. She knew that in this land, truth was often the first casualty of fear. "He's wounded," she said, softly glancing up. Marshal Cole's voice cracked through the murmurs, sharp as the crack of a whip. "One of the teamsters got a shot off. He'll be looking for water, maybe a place to hide." $100 in federal gold. The promise of money shifted the air in Redemption Gulch. Eyes flicked to one another, silently weighing the worth of a man's life. $100 could change everything for a struggling family. Clara Hayes finished her work, wiping her hands on a rag. She gave instructions to Buck O'Connor's wife in a low, soothing voice, making sure she understood how to care for him. But inside, Clara's mind raced. As she walked back toward her infirmary, she veered off the main road, taking a longer route. Her eyes scanned the alleyways, the scrub brush along the town's edge. It was a habit born from her physician's instinct, always watching, always searching for signs of trouble, no matter how small. Then she saw it. Behind the livery near the mesquite grove that bordered the creek bed, a small dark red stain on a pale gray rock. Fresh. She glanced around. The street buzzed with the excitement of Marshal Cole's arrival, and no one seemed to notice her. Driven by curiosity that overpowered her fear, Clara followed the faint trail. A drop here, a smear on a cactus leaf there. The trail led her into the cool shadows of the creek bed, a sandy wash shaded by cottonwoods. And there, slumped against the gnarled roots of a tree, was a man. He was Apache. His black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and though his face was etched with pain, there was still a pride in his features, sharp and fierce. He wore buckskin breeches and worn moccasins. His chest and shoulder were a blood-soaked mess, a makeshift bandage of torn cloth pressed against the wound. In his lap lay an old single-shot rifle. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. He was dying. This was Tate Blackwolf, the murderer. For a moment Clara froze. Every warning, every fear ingrained in her by the stories and the people around her screamed at her to turn back, to run, to raise the alarm and collect the $100 reward. This was the monster they all feared, the savage killer Marshal Cole had described. But then Clara's training kicked in. She didn't see a monster. She saw a patient. She saw a man with a catastrophic chest wound, the unmistakable signs of a punctured lung and the pallor of massive blood loss. She saw a human being in agony slipping away. The Hippocratic oath she had taken in a clean, sterile lecture hall in Philadelphia had not included exclusions for geography or race. "First, do no harm," she whispered under her breath as she took a slow, deliberate step forward. The man's eyes snapped open. They were black deep and filled with a defiant fire that even death could not extinguish. His hands, slick with his own blood, tightened around the rifle. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. Clara held up her empty hands. "I am a healer," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I am a doctor. You're badly hurt. Let me help you." He watched her, his gaze taking in every detail. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. He saw the medical bag in her other hand. His eyes narrowed as he waged a silent, agonizing battle inside. To trust this white woman could be a trap, a trick to lead him to a rope or a bullet. But to refuse her help was certain death. Slowly, agonizingly, his grip on the rifle loosened. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the permission Clara needed. She knelt beside him, her instincts as a physician, overriding everything else. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. More to herself than to him as she gently peeled back the crude bandage. The wound was worse than she had feared. A bullet, likely from a heavy caliber, had torn through his pectoral muscle and lodged deep in his shoulder, dangerously close to the lung. He needed surgery, and he needed it now. "You can't stay here," she whispered urgently. "They're hunting you. The whole town is looking for you." She could hear Marshal Cole's voice organizing a search party in the distance. Time was running out. Clara made a decision reckless and potentially career-ending. "Can you walk?" she asked, already knowing the answer. With a grimace, the Apache warrior pushed himself up, using his good arm, but immediately collapsed back, gasping in pain. Clara steadied him. "All right," she said, her mind working with frenzied clarity. "All right, we're going." She slung her medical bag over her shoulder and looped his good arm over her own, taking on a significant portion of his weight. He was heavier than she expected, lean muscle and bone. "Come on," she urged, her voice soft but insistent. "We have to go. My infirmary is the only place that can help you." He grunted, his breath heavy and labored hot against her ear. Together they stumbled through the creek bed, each step a gamble. They moved from shadow to shadow, using the livery stable and the water trough as cover. Every step felt like a life or death risk. Each distant shout sent a jolt of fear racing through them. The infirmary, a small adobe building tucked away at the end of the street, felt like it was miles away. Somehow they made it to the back door unseen. Inside, the familiar scent of antiseptic and clean linen wrapped around them like a sanctuary. Clara helped him onto the examination table, his blood immediately soaking into the white sheet beneath him. He collapsed onto his back, his body trembling with pain. Clara bolted the back door with quick, practiced hands, then walked to the front. Her legs shook with the weight of everything happening, but she slid the heavy iron bolt across. She pulled the curtains over the windows, drowning the room in a dim, dusty light. For a moment she leaned against the door, her eyes closing as the magnitude of her actions hit her all at once. She was harboring a fugitive. A man accused of murder. A man hunted by one of the most relentless marshals in the territory. Then came the sharp knock at the front door. "Dr. Hayes." Zeke Taylor's voice grated from the other side. "Marshal Cole wants to speak with everyone. Open up." Clara's blood went cold. She glanced at the Apache warrior on her table. His life was literally in her hands. Her gaze flicked to the bolted door, the only thing separating them from the inevitable fate that awaited him outside. She took a deep breath and walked to the door, unbolting it just enough to speak through the crack. "I'm with a patient," she said. Her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Zeke's suspicious eyes peered through the gap. "The marshal is addressing the town in front of the saloon. Your presence is required." Clara's heart raced, but her tone remained firm. "As soon as I am able. My patient's well-being comes first. That is the oath I took." Zeke hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being defied, especially by a woman. But there was something in Clara's unyielding gaze that made him back down, at least for now. "See that you are," he muttered, stalking off. Clara quickly shut and bolted the door again, her heart thudding in her chest. She turned back to the Apache warrior. His dark eyes were fixed on her, filled with pain, suspicion, and something else she couldn't quite decipher. She knew with a chilling certainty that this was just the beginning. Marshal Cole wouldn't be deterred for long. The hunt would only intensify. The town would be turned inside out, and her small infirmary had just become the most dangerous place in the entire Arizona territory. Clara had made her choice in the creek bed, and now the consequences were locked inside with her. Outside, the world seemed to shrink and fade. The only reality was the dim, dusty light, the metallic scent of blood, and the ragged breaths of the man lying on her table. Time no longer moved with the sun. It was measured by the desperate beat of heartbeats, his and hers. I need to get the bullet out, Clara said aloud, more to steady herself than to him. It's festering. Tate Blackwolf watched her closely. He hadn't spoken a word, his communication. A quiet storm of sharp glances and the tight set of his jaw. He was like a cornered wolf, and for now, she was the only thing standing between him and the hunters. Clara stoked the small stove in the corner, setting a pot of water to boil. She laid out her instruments, a scalpel, forceps, probes, and a silver cauterizing iron, each one gleaming in the low light. The sight of them made Tate tense, his hand instinctively drifting toward the knife still sheathed at his belt. Clara stopped, meeting his gaze with calm determination. I know this is frightening, she said softly, but if this bullet stays in, the poison will spread. You'll die slowly, painfully. She picked up the bottle of laudanum. This will help with the pain. It'll make you sleep. Tate stared at the bottle, then back at her, his distrust etched deeply around his eyes. To his people, a potion that brought on sleep was the weapon of tricksters, of enemies. It meant vulnerability. It meant death. He shook his head sharply, a single decisive gesture. Then he tapped his chest with his good hand and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly, with pain and disuse. The words were guttural, strange to Clara's ear, but the meaning was clear. I will stay awake. A chill ran down Clara's spine, not fear but respect. He was choosing to endure the full, unrelenting horror of her work rather than surrender to sleep. All right. She nodded, her resolve hardening. Whiskey then, and something to bite on. She poured a generous measure of rye into a tin cup. Tate drank it in 2 long swallows, the fire of the liquor flashing in his eyes. His eyes watered, but his expression remained unchanged. Clara handed him a thick piece of folded leather. He clenched it between his teeth. Hold still, she commanded, her voice steady, the doctor in her now fully in charge. This is it. The next 20 minutes were a descent into a private hell. Clara worked quickly, her delicate instruments probing the wound, searching for the bullet buried deep within his flesh. Tate Blackwolf's body went rigid under her touch. Sweat beaded on his forehead, streaming down his temples. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. A low, continuous groan escaped from between his clenched teeth, the leather gag muffling the sound. The noise was a raw, soul-wrenching agony, one that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards beneath them. But he didn't cry out. He didn't move. His eyes, burning with feverish light, never left hers. They were filled with defiance, trust and hatred all at once. Clara worked through his pain, sweat stinging her eyes as she focused on the task at hand. She felt the scrape of metal against bone. I've got it, she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. With one final twist of the forceps, she pulled the bullet free. It was a misshapen, ugly lump, flattened and brutal, a harbinger of death that she now held in her hand. Tate's body went limp, the tension in him finally releasing in a shuddering wave. He was still conscious, but barely. The ordeal had taken nearly all he had left. Now came the most dangerous part. Clara picked up a heated probe, and the sickening smell of searing flesh filled the room as she cauterized the wound. The flesh sizzled, and Tate convulsed violently, a sharp, involuntary jerk, before lying still. Clara cleaned the area, packing it with gauze soaked in carbolic acid, and bandaged it tightly. His breathing was still shallow, but it had steadied. The immediate threat of him bleeding out was over, but the battle against infection and fever was just beginning. Outside the town was a powder keg ready to explode. Marshal Cole, enraged by the defiance of the town doctor and the disappearance of his quarry, had declared Redemption Gulch under martial law. His deputies, led by the officious Zeke Taylor, went door to door. They searched barns, stables, and even the church, showing no mercy. Their methods were brutal, their questions and accusations more threats than inquiries. Sheriff Wade Carter protested, his face flushed with indignation. Marshal, these are good people. You can't treat them like criminals. Cole rounded on him, his voice like cracking ice. There's a killer hiding among your good people, Sheriff. That makes one of them a liar and the rest of them potential accomplices. I'll tear this town apart board by board until I find him. Anyone who impedes this investigation will be arrested for harboring a federal fugitive. The threat hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The townsfolk, already terrified of the Apache, were now paralyzed by fear of the law. Friendships cracked under the strain, suspicion spreading like a toxic weed. Jed Harrow, the store owner, peered from behind his counter, watching Zeke rifle through a sack of flour, his mind calculating the cost of loyalty. Pastor Caleb stood on the steps of his chapel, Bible in hand, silently rebuking the armed men desecrating his sanctuary. In the saloon, Sadie Malone, who missed nothing, polished glasses and listened, filing away, every whispered rumor, every nervous twitch. The infirmary, however, remained an island of tense silence in the storm. Clara knew it was only a matter of time before Marshal Cole's attention focused directly on her. Her initial rebuff of Zeke had been a temporary shield, but it had also painted a target on her back. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody orange shadows across the street, Tate's fever began to climb. He thrashed in delirium, muttering in his native tongue. Clara bathed his forehead with cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea, an old frontier remedy for fever, between his cracked lips. In his delirium, names and places spilled from his mouth, garbled and frantic. Chiricahua Goyakla Nana Loco. He whispered the names of people and places, but then a phrase repeated over and over, laced with urgency. Nakadilan. Nakadilan. And then in heavily accented English, white eyes lies. Clara leaned in closer. What lies? Who lies? His fever, bright eyes fluttered open. They seemed to look through her, beyond her. Wagon, not us. He muttered, his voice weak and strained. Nakadilan. Then he lapsed back into his native tongue, his body racked with shivers. A seed of doubt planted in the creek bed began to sprout in Clara's mind. What if he wasn't part of the raiding party? What if he had been there for another reason? The name he kept repeating, Nakadilan, meant renegades, or those who are outcast. A heavy boot thumped against the front door, jolting her from her thoughts. It wasn't a knock, it was a summons. Dr. Hayes, this is Marshal Cole. Open this door. Now. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. Clara Hayes stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, staring at Tate Blackwolf, delirious and utterly helpless on the examination table. There was no hiding him now. The room still smelled of blood, the sharp, acrid scent of burned flesh lingering in the air. She was trapped. Her mind raced, frantic with the knowledge that lying would be impossible, especially to a man like Marshal Cole. But telling the truth would seal the fate of the man on her table. Clara walked to the door, her movements mechanical, her thoughts spinning in a blur. She couldn't hide forever. With a trembling hand, she unbolted the door and opened it to face the Marshal. Standing on her doorstep, flanked by Zeke Taylor and another deputy, Cole's face was a mask of cold fury. His icy winter eyes locked onto hers. My patience has expired, Doctor, he said, his voice dangerously low. My men tell me you were seen near the creek bed this afternoon, right where we lost the Apache's trail. Then you barricaded yourself in here and refused to cooperate. You will now explain yourself. Clara straightened up, despite feeling dwarfed by the towering presence of the Marshal. I am a physician, Marshal, she replied, her voice steady. My work is private and my duty is to my patient. It's a duty that does not concern me. Cole sneered, his lip curling. Everything in this town now concerns me. I have a federal warrant to search any and all premises for a fugitive. Are you going to step aside, or will my men have to remove you? The moment of truth had come. Behind her in the shadows, Tate's life hung in the balance. Before her stood the unmovable force of the law. You are not welcome in my infirmary without my permission. Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "That permission is mine to give." Cole's eyes glittered coldly. "You seem to believe your permission is enough for me." He motioned to his men. "Zeke, take her." Zeke reached for Clara's arm, a smug look spreading across his face. But before he could touch her, Clara did the one thing they never expected. She stepped back inside, slammed the heavy oak door shut, and threw the bolt with a solid, resonant thud. The air outside went still. Then she did more. Clara grabbed a heavy bookshelf loaded with medical texts from Philadelphia and dragged it across the floor. She braced it against the door. Then she shoved a chair behind it. A small table followed, creating a makeshift barricade. Outside, there was a stunned silence before Marshal Cole's roar of pure, unadulterated rage pierced the air. "You are under arrest for aiding and abetting a federal fugitive. You've sealed your own fate, woman." A deafening crash shook the door as one of Cole's deputies slammed the butt of his rifle into it. Then another crash came, followed by the crack of splintering wood. Clara backed away from her barricade, her chest heaving with fear and adrenaline. She looked back at Tate, who had been jolted awake by the noise. His eyes were now clear, lucid. He understood what was happening. He understood the sacrifice she was making for him. Reaching for the knife at his belt, Tate drew it not as a threat to her, but as a tool. He pointed it toward the old rifle lying on the floor where Clara had left it. Then he pointed to the window. Clara's eyes widened in horror. "No, I am not a killer." Tate shook his head, wincing with the effort. He pointed at the window again, then made a motion with his hand, as if breaking something, not shooting, but creating a deterrent, a standoff. The door splintered again. Another crash. The deputies were almost through. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the heavy rifle. It felt alien in her grip, as a tool of destruction she had never wielded before. She had dedicated her life to healing bodies, not breaking them. But now in this moment, she was forced to hold a weapon designed for violence. She crept to the front window, peering through the slit in the curtain. Outside she could see Marshal Cole directing his men, his face livid in the fading twilight. "Break it down," he shouted. Clara took a deep breath and pointed the rifle toward the sky, pulling the trigger. The explosion inside the small room was deafening. The rifle recoiled so violently that it nearly tore from her hand, slamming the stock into her shoulder and sending a sharp shock of pain through her arm. Outside, everything stopped. The pounding on the door ceased. Cole and his men froze, turning to stare at the infirmary. A warning shot. The line had been crossed. This was no longer an investigation. It was a siege. In the ensuing silence, Clara's voice, amplified by raw terror and pure adrenaline, rang out into the street. "He is my patient under my care. The next shot will not be aimed at the sky. Leave us be." A collective gasp rippled through the townsfolk who had gathered at a safe distance to watch. The quiet reserve doctor from the east had just declared war on a U.S. Marshal. Marshal Cole's face was unreadable. Then slowly, a chilling smile spread across his lips. "This is a language I understand far better than legal arguments or moral pleas." He called out, his voice carrying in the heavy silence. "Fine. Have it your way, doctor." Cole sneered, his cold eyes narrowing. "We'll see how long your newfound courage lasts when the sun comes up. We'll see how brave you are when you're out of water, out of food, and staring down a firing squad. He turned to Zeke Taylor, his voice sharp and commanding. "Surround the building. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out. If she so much as opens a curtain, shoot to kill." As night fell, a ring of steel closed around the small adobe building. Inside, Clara Hayes stood in the dim light, the rifle smoke stinging her eyes. Her body trembled with the aftershocks of what she had just done. She had stood between a wounded man and a firing squad, and in doing so she had placed herself squarely in their sights. The legend had begun, written in gunpowder and defiance, in the heart of a town holding its breath. The night pressed in on the infirmary, thick with menace and the weight of Marshal Cole's promise. Every gust of wind rattled the window frames like the footsteps of ghosts. Every creak of the old adobe was a prelude to the splintering of the door in a final fatal rush. Inside, Clara and Tate Blackwolf were prisoners locked in a fortress of their own making. The world beyond the drawn curtains was now a threatening shadow closing in on them. Clara's shoulder throbbed with a dull ache where the rifle stock had slammed into her earlier. It was a constant reminder of the line she had crossed. She was no longer just a physician bound by an oath. She was an armed combatant, a woman who had defied federal law. Tate was weak, the fever from his wound clinging to him like a suffocating shroud, but his mind remained sharp. The shared explosive violence of the warning shot had forged a strange, unspoken bond between them. He watched her from the examination table as she checked his dressing. His dark eyes spoke volumes, a depth of understanding that transcended their separate languages. "They will not wait for the sun," he rasped, his voice strained but stronger than before. "A man like Cole, his pride is a hungry animal. He must feed it." Clara's fingers moved swiftly as she reloaded the single-shot rifle, a futile, symbolic gesture that gave her a slight sense of control. "He thinks you're a murderer," she said, her voice tight. "He said you attacked a supply wagon and killed 3 men. Tate struggled to push himself up on his good elbow, his face a mask of pain and contempt. "Cole's men find a wagon, they find dead white eyes. They find Apache tracks. For a man like him, the story writes itself. The truth is an inconvenience." He shook his head, a bitter, weary motion. "My tracks were there, yes. But I was not with the raiding party. I was hunting them." Clara paused, the rifle forgotten in her lap. "Hunting them? Why?" "They are Nakadalun," he said sharply, his voice filled with disgust. "Outcasts, renegades. They follow their own law of greed and blood, led by a man named Chateau. He is a ghost who brings the whirlwind, and he brings shame upon the name of the Chiricahua." Tate's gaze was fierce, burning with a fire that seemed to keep the fever at bay. "My chief sent me to stop them before their violence brought the blue-coated soldiers down upon our winter camps, upon our women and children. Chateau and his dogs do not care who suffers for their crimes." The revelation struck Clara like a physical blow, inverting everything she thought she knew. The man on her table wasn't a vicious killer. He was a lawman in his own right, condemned by the very prejudice he fought against. "They trade what they steal." Tate continued, his voice dropping low. "Mules, rifles. They trade it all for more guns and whiskey that poisons their souls. From a white man," Clara pressed, leaning closer. "Who? Where is he?" Tate's voice grew softer, more pained. "I do not know his name," he admitted. "His brand. It is a circle that is broken," he said quietly, the words holding a weight of despair. A broken circle. The image seared itself into Clara's mind, a cryptic symbol that held the key to everything. Outside the siege continued a boot on the throat of Redemption Gulch. Marshal Cole had effectively declared martial law, his deputies moving with arrogant authority. Their searches were rough, their questions sharp with accusation. Sheriff Wade Carter, his face flushed with indignation, had confronted the marshal, but his protests were futile. The threat of federal arrest hung over the town, and suspicion like a foul weed took root. Inside the saloon, Sadie Malone kept a steady hand as she served whiskey. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. She watched Zeke and another deputy drinking at a corner table, speaking in low, slurred tones. "She'll crack by morning," Zeke muttered, slamming his glass down. "That doctor's got no sand. Kane will make an example of her." Sadie replied coolly, wiping down their table. Her presence was as unobtrusive as a shadow, but her words were sharp with a quiet understanding. "A shame. She saved my nephew from the croup last winter. Now she's harboring an Apache killer." The other deputy grunted. "She gets what she deserves." Sadie Malone's eyes narrowed, though only slightly, as she turned away. She had lived in this territory long enough to know things. Secrets whispered in the shadows, the faces behind the deals, and who had a reputation for cutting corners to get rich. She knew the brands of every major ranch in a 100-mile radius, the one with the broken circle. The name hovered at the edge of her thoughts, a dangerous piece of knowledge. Back in the infirmary, a more immediate crisis was unfolding. The water was almost gone. Tate's fever had left him desperately dehydrated, and Clara's own throat burned from thirst. She could feel Marshal Cole's strategy taking shape, brutal but effective. Thirst would break them long before bullets ever would. The roof? Tate rasped his gaze, fixed on the ceiling. There's a cistern behind the building. Clara knew exactly which one he meant. A large wooden barrel under a downspout, likely filled with stagnant water. But it was water. The alley behind the infirmary was dark, less guarded than the front, but still a suicide mission if she was caught. Yet staying here, and letting herself and Tate slowly succumb to thirst, was just as much a death sentence. "Stay here," she commanded softly, taking the empty canteen. "Don't make a sound." Moving like a ghost, Clara unlatched the scuttle hatch in the ceiling, her heart pounding. She cracked it open and peered into the deep, star-filled night. Below, she could see the dark shape of the cistern. A deputy stood watch, about 30 yards away, his back turned. Clara's heart beat in her chest, frantic and wild. She hoisted herself through the hatch and crawled onto the gritty adobe roof, moving like a lizard, her hands and knees scraping against the rough surface. She reached the back edge of the roof, right above the cistern. She had no rope, but she thought quickly. She ripped long strips from her petticoat, her hands shaking as she tied them together, testing each knot with a prayer. Carefully, she lowered the makeshift rope, the canteen dangling at its end. Inch by agonizing inch, she fed out the line until she felt the slight tug of it hitting the water. A rush of relief almost made her dizzy. Slowly, carefully, she began to haul the canteen back up. It was heavy, and the knots strained against the weight. Just as the canteen cleared the lip of the barrel, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, what was that sound?" The deputy. He'd heard the scrape. Clara froze, pressing herself flat against the roof, her breath caught in her throat. She watched him turn, take a few steps toward the infirmary, peering into the shadows. "Probably just a coyote," he mumbled to himself. Another voice called lazily from the street. It was Zeke. Getting jumpy, the deputy grunted. "Maybe." He hesitated, and in that moment Clara felt time stretch into eternity. Finally, he turned and walked back to his post. Clara waited, her body rigid with terror, before pulling the canteen the rest of the way up. She crawled back to the hatch, sliding inside and sealing it shut behind her. Leaning against the wall in the darkness, Clara held the full canteen to her chest. It was a small victory, but it was everything. She gave Tate the water first. As she took a sip herself, she knew they had bought another day. But she also knew they had to use it wisely. A soft, furtive scratching at the back door made her jump. It wasn't the heavy pounding of a deputy. "Dr. Hayes," a boy's voice whispered. "It's me, Jesse O'Connor." Clara's eyes widened. She crept to the door. "Jesse, what are you doing? It's not safe." "I know," the boy whispered back, his voice tight with fear. "But Ma said I had to. She said you saved Pa's life, and we O'Connells pay our debts." A small cloth bundle was pushed under the door. Jesse's voice continued. "She packed you some bread and jerky." Clara's heart swelled with emotion, her eyes stinging with tears. In the middle of all the fear and chaos, a spark of loyalty had endured. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in her mind. "Jesse," she whispered, "can you do something for me? Something secret and very important." "Yes, ma'am," he answered without hesitation. "I need you to take a note. Not for me, but to stop more people from getting hurt. You cannot let anyone see you. Take it to Miss Sadie at the saloon. Give it only to her." Clara whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "I can do that." On the back of a prescription slip, Clara scribbled the two crucial words, "broken circle." She underlined them twice, adding a question mark beneath them. Tying the note to a small rock, She pushed it through a grated ventilation shaft low on the wall. She heard Jesse scramble to retrieve it, his small footsteps fading into the night, a fragile, heroic echo in the oppressive silence. Now all they could do was wait. Wait for the sun. Wait for Cole's wrath. And wait to see if a saloon owner and a blacksmith's son could unravel a conspiracy that even a U.S. Marshal had failed to see. As dawn broke, it cast a hard, accusing glare over Redemption Gulch. The town, frozen in fear, stood like a grim tableau, armed deputies forming a ring around the small adobe building, the splintered wood of the infirmary door, and the tense watching eyes of the townsfolk. Marshal Jesper Cole stood at the center of the street, the picture of patient authority. He had given them the night. Now he was ready for his victory. "Dr. Hayes," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Your time has expired. The games are over. Send out the Apache now, and I will take your cooperation into account when you are tried for treason." Inside, the air was thick with desperation. Clara looked at Tate, who held a knife in his good hand, not as a weapon of attack, but as a final, grim assurance of his own end. "Do not let them take me alive," he whispered. "My spirit will not be caged." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the end of the line. Before she could shout a final, useless refusal, a new sound cut through the tension. Two figures were approaching with a purposeful stride. Sheriff Wade Carter, his face set with newfound determination, and Sadie Malone, walking with calm resolve, a rebuke to the fear that hung over them all. Cole turned, his face tightening with annoyance. "Sheriff, this is a federal matter. I advise you to return to your office before you are charged with obstruction." "It stopped being just a federal matter when you put my town in a stranglehold," Marshal Wade said, his voice loud and steady. "This is a murder investigation, and I have new evidence." "Evidence?" Cole's cold eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring. Sadie stepped forward, holding up a small, heavy object in her palm. "Pike and another of your deputies got drunk in my saloon last night," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "One of them dropped this." She held the brass cartridge casing higher. "It's a 50-70 Sharps Army issue. Once upon a time. The same heavy caliber that killed those Teamsters." Pike went pale. That's a sphere. I collect old casings," he stammered. "A fine story," Sadie said, her tone dripping with disdain. "The Army hasn't used that caliber in years. But you know who still loves them? Buffalo hunters and certain powerful ranchers who like a rifle that can punch through a grizzly bear. Or a man." Cole waved a dismissive hand, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "A cartridge casing proves nothing. On its own, maybe not." Wade shot back. "But it starts to paint a picture." Wade's gaze swept past Cole, settling on the imposing figure of Leland Bart Cross, standing near the land office. "Isn't that right, Mr. Cross?" he said. Bart Cross straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he caught the sheriff's gaze. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff," he said, his voice smooth. "Don't you?" Wade pressed his voice, gaining strength. "Dr. Hayes' patient, the man you want, dead, told her his people were tracking renegades. Renegades who were selling stolen goods to a powerful white man whose brand was a broken circle." The collective gaze of the town shifted, settling on Cross like a weight too heavy to ignore. Cross forced a brittle laugh, but it rang hollow. "That's utterly absurd," he said, his voice shaking. "You're taking the word of a murdering savage over a respected citizen." "We are," came a new voice, solemn and resonant. The crowd parted, and Pastor Caleb walked slowly from the chapel, his Bible held against his chest. His presence lent an unassailable gravity to the proceedings, because one of Mr. Cross's own ranch hands, a young man named Sam, Billy Turner, came to me for confession. At first light, Pastor Caleb said, his voice calm but heavy with truth. His conscience was a greater burden than his fear. The priest's words fell like stones into a silent pool. The mask of arrogant denial on Cross's face began to crack. "The boy confessed," Pastor Caleb continued. that Mr. Cross hired a band of Apache renegades to stage the raid. The Teamsters were never meant to be killed, but the renegades were drunk on whiskey that Mr. Cross himself supplied. He wanted the raid blamed on the local Chiricahua to get them driven off the lands that bordered his own. The whole ugly conspiracy was laid bare. It had never been about justice. It was about greed. Marshal Jasper Cole stood his face a thundercloud of conflicting emotions. He'd been played. The great finisher had become a pawn in a common land grab. The humiliation was a poison burning through his veins. Leland Bart Cross saw the game was up. His eyes, like those of a cornered wolf, darted around seeking an escape that didn't exist. His hand drifted toward the custom-made revolver at his hip. Lies he spat. All of it. A conspiracy to ruin me. Then why Sheriff Wade Carter's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. Why did Billy Lee tell me you paid the renegades with 3 new Sharps rifles? And why did I find a box of 50-70 Carter de BFV 70 cartridges in your saddlebags this morning, identical to the one Zeke Taylor dropped? That was the final damning nail. Cross didn't bother with another denial. He moved. His hand was a blur as it snatched the revolver from its holster. His face contorted with a mix of spite and rage. He aimed at the infirmary door. "If I'm going down," he roared, "that redskin is going down with me." He fired. The heavy slug tore through the weakened wood of the door with a deafening crack. Inside, Clara Hayes screamed as the standoff shattered. It was the tipping point. Marshal Cole moved with shocking speed, his pistol materializing in his hand. But in that split second, as his instincts screamed at him to neutralize the threat, his rigid worldview fractured. He saw Cross's treachery. He saw that the law he had served had been twisted. Justice demanded the scales be rebalanced. Cole turned and fired a single shot, not at Cross, but into the dirt at the feet of his own deputy. "Stand down!" Cole bellowed, his voice the roar of a wounded lion. "All of you, stand down!" His men froze, shocked and confused. Cross seized the moment. He fired again at the infirmary, then spun and bolted toward the livery stable. 2 of his ranch hands drew their weapons and fired into the street, providing cover and sending the townspeople into a panic. Chaos erupted. Inside the infirmary, the second bullet had galvanized a sun. Tate Blackwolf saw Cross escaping. A lifetime of warrior instincts kicked in. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved the heavy examination table aside, threw the bolt, and kicked the splintered door open, stepping into the blinding sunlight. His knife was held low and ready. He ignored the deputies, ignored the chaos. His eyes locked on Cross. Cole saw him emerge, and for a fraction of a second his old instincts flared. But he choked it down, his mind replaying the priest's confession. He hesitated. That hesitation was all Tate needed. He sprinted, his wounded body protesting with every stride, his will pure iron. He cut across the street, a silent, deadly shadow. Cross reached his horse and was swinging into the saddle when Tate hit him. He tackled him with the force of a striking panther, driving him to the ground. Cross's gun went skittering across the dust. The 2 ranch hands turned their fire on the struggling men, but before they could aim, a deafening boom erupted from the saloon doorway. Sadie Malone stood there, a sawed-off shotgun braced against her hip, smoke curling from one barrel. One of the ranch hands cried out, clutching his leg and collapsing. The other, seeing Sheriff Carter and Marshal Cole advancing on him, threw his gun down in surrender. The gunfight was over. In the sudden ringing silence, all eyes turned to the middle of the street. Tate stood over the sputtering, defeated form of Bart Cross. He held his knife to the cattle baron's throat. The entire town held its breath, expecting the savage vengeance they had been taught to anticipate. But Tate didn't kill him. He looked from Cross's terrified face to Clara standing in the infirmary doorway. Then he glanced at Marshal Cole, whose face was an unreadable canvas of awe and shame. With one final look of contempt, Tate pulled his knife away, stood and kicked Cross's discarded pistol into the dust. He hadn't been hunting for vengeance. He had been hunting for justice. He walked back toward the infirmary, his duty done. As he passed Marshal Cole, he stopped a few feet from him, meeting his gaze with the quiet dignity of a man who had been vindicated. Cole holstered his pistol, the sound sealing the end of an error. Sheriff Cole said, his voice quiet and heavy, "Put Mr. Cross in irons. He's a federal prisoner now." The siege of Redemption Gulch was over. The truth unearthed by the courage of a few had finally exploded into the open. In the aftermath, the silence that fell over the town wasn't one of fear, but of profound reassessment. The townsfolk looked at each other and the key players in the siege as if seeing them for the first time. The simple lines of their world had been redrawn. Leland Bart Cross and his men were locked in the town jail. Their downfall was a stark testament to the explosive truths revealed earlier that day. Later that afternoon, Marshal Jasper Cole appeared at Clara Hayes' open door. His hat was clutched in his hands. The iron authority that had once defined him was replaced by a humility that seemed to cost him dearly. Sheriff Wade Carter stood a few paces behind a silent witness to this monumental shift. "My investigation was compromised by prejudice," Cole said, his voice low but clear, meant for both Clara and Tate to hear. "You upheld your oath, Doctor, when I almost broke mine. You have my respect." He then turned to face Tate, who rested on the cot. "The charges are dropped. You're a free man. My official report will exonerate your tribe completely and name Cross and the Narca de Lan as the guilty parties. You'll have a federal escort back to your territory." It wasn't an apology, but something more significant, an admission of truth from a man who had only ever dealt in facts. Tate gave a single slow nod of acknowledgement. Justice, hard-won and overdue, had been served. The next morning, Tate prepared to ride out. Clara met him by his horse, pressing a small pouch of herbs and clean bandages into his hand. Their farewell was quiet, the understanding between them deeper than words. "You have a strong heart," Shashindu Tate said, using the Apache term for doctor woman. "You stood for a man you didn't know." "My people will not forget this. I stood for what was right, Tate," Clara replied softly. "That's all." He reached out not to shake her hand, but to gently touch her bruised shoulder, the place where the rifle had kicked her, a shared silent acknowledgement of the price they had paid for their stand. Then, with a final look at the woman in the infirmary doorway, Tate mounted his horse and rode out, a solitary figure, disappearing into the shimmering heat of his homeland. Clara Hayes never saw him again. Life in Redemption Gulch found a new footing. Clara was no longer an outsider. She had become the town's fierce, protective heart. Her loyalty repaid in kind by all she had helped. Sheriff Wade Carter walked with a newfound authority. His easy nature was now backed by the steel of conviction. Even the legend of Marshal Cole transformed. Tales of his relentlessness were now forever tempered by the story of a man who learned the hard difference between law and justice in a dusty town he almost destroyed. And like all good frontier legends, the story grew. In retellings around campfires, Clara's single shot became a dozen, and Tate became a phantom warrior who fought off 20 men, but the core of the tale, the truth of it, remained untouched. It was the story of courage, overpowering fear and integrity, standing tall against brute force. Clara Hayes remained in Redemption Gulch, healing the sick, delivering new life into the world. She never sought recognition, but the legend had now become part of her. Strangers would look at the quiet doctor with a sense of wonder, seeing not just a physician, but a living testament to the fact that the most enduring battles of the West weren't always fought with a gun, but with unwavering conviction. And so the legend of Dr. Clara Hayes and the wounded Apache became woven into the very fabric of the Arizona Territory. It serves as a powerful reminder that history isn't shaped only by famous generals and gunslingers, but by the extraordinary courage of ordinary people in impossible situations. It's a story about looking past prejudice to find the truth, and about how one person's refusal to back down can change the course of lives and challenge the conscience of a nation. The Wild West was a land not just filled with rifles and railroads, but with moments of profound integrity just like this one. If this story of frontier courage moved you and you believe these tales of honor and grit deserve to be told, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more legends from the dusty trails of history. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.